right. Hi, everyone. Oh, yeah, I have a clicker. Great. I'm going to wander around. Um, this is Hong Kong. This is my hometown and the city that I grew up in. And for the last 4 months, every morning when I wake up, I still groggy from sleep and I pick up my phone and check Twitter because that's what I do. Images like these would come streaming across my feed. Hong Kong has had pro democracy, anti government protests for the last 4 months, and they've really escalated over the last several weeks. As a person and as a Hong Konger, as a child of the city, I see these images and I feel sad, I feel anger, and I feel frustrated. And I feel no small measure of guilt for not being there and for not doing more, for watching it all unfold from the comfort of my own bed and the safety of my own home in London. As a journalist, I look at what is going on in Hong Kong and I also feel despair, but for quite different reasons. Press freedom has been on the decline sharply since the protests have started. My colleagues, other reporters, cameramen, they've been tear gassed, they've been attacked, they've been injured just for doing their jobs. Rumors, fake news, misinformation are being created, shared, and amplified on social media faster than they can be debunked and fact checked. And it's not even really just sort of one side versus the other, it's not the good guys or the bad guys. Both sides are doing it. So this one, which is allegedly about a big fire, which never happened, in one of the biggest malls in Hong Kong, are being created and shared by the so-called blue ribbon, the people who support the government and the police. But this one, which is about a protester that was injured when a taxi crashed into a crowd of protesters, allegedly showing the break in her leg, which is not true, is being shared by the yellow ribbon, the people who are supportive of the protesters. And partly as a result of all this, partly as a result of what is happening in society, people don't really trust the information that they see, and they don't really trust journalists anymore. But I think it's not even really just that overnight the people of Hong Kong decided that journalists have become incompetent, or that journalists have become evil, or that we no longer know how to do our jobs and we can't verify the facts and report and tell you what is happening in a fair way. I think it's more that the society has become so polarized and people have become so sort of caught up in what is going on that they feel like maybe it is war of a sort, that maybe it's so polarizing that you're either with us or you're against us. And if you claim to say that you are somewhere in the middle, that you're trying to be objective, well, chances are you probably have some secret ulterior motive that is really suspect. And that's when we really don't trust you. And if any of that sounds at all familiar, that's because it probably is. I mean, this isn't really just happening in Hong Kong alone. It's happening all over the world. The Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in Oxford, which conducts one of the most comprehensive and long-running global surveys about attitudes towards the news and attitudes towards media, have found that over just the last 5 years alone, across many of the markets that they survey, trust in news has gone down by a full 10%. And this year, this is from this year's report, we've kind of crossed the threshold. For the first time, less than half of the people surveyed say that they don't even trust the news that they use, let alone the news that they disagree with or the news in general. And one of the consequences of this is that people are actually actively trying to avoid coming into contact with the news. In the UK, where I live, more than 1 in 3 people now say that they sometimes or often actively try to avoid the news, and it's one of the countries where there's been the biggest jump, and probably no prizes for guessing what's causing it. But it's also really interesting when you look a bit deeper and see what reasons people give for why they do this now, because those reasons are all emotional. So they try to avoid the news because it has a negative impact on their mood, it makes them feel bad. They try to avoid the news because it makes them feel helpless. There's nothing that they feel like they can do about it. And it's only after those two reasons that they get to, I avoid the news because I can't trust it anymore. I can't rely on it to be true. So what do we do as journalists in the face of these social changes and these social conditions? What do we do as journalists, as news organizations? I think that we need a new form of journalism. I think that we need journalism that remains very, very grounded and rooted in a rigorous sort of factual truth, but that we also need journalism that honors and speaks to and acknowledges people's emotional truths. That as journalists, we need to actually work a lot harder in trying to spark curiosity, to try to encourage exploration and discovery, instead of just assuming that we've done a lot of hard work, what we have found out is really important, and therefore you should be interested. And I think we need journalism that doesn't just provide facts as a service, but also provides empathy as a service. And that's the work that I've been trying to do at the Financial Times for the last couple of years alongside my colleagues. And what does that look like in practice? I think that some of it looks like trying to learn from storytelling traditions and ways of presenting information that is very, very different and very far from what traditional news is. It might look like journalism that is also a computer game. So a couple of years ago, we made something called the Uber game. It's a free online news game available at ft.com/ubergame, so you can all play it while I explain it what it is on stage, where you play as a full-time Uber driver in San Francisco, trying to make a living. And it's a piece where we have tried to combine the stories and the emotional truths of what it is like to be in the gig economy, to have to make a living from doing this, with the factual truths of the economics of the system, the numbers that underpin the system. So it's a kind of choose your own adventure game. You drive around, you complete fares, you make money doing that. And in the course of doing so, we present dilemmas and choices and questions that you have to decide on. So in this particular case, you had promised your son that you would be home by 7 p.m. in time for dinner and to help him with his homework, which is due the next day. As 7 p.m. rolls around, you get a message from the Uber app saying that you're just a few rides from finishing your daily quest, which would earn you, if you finish it, a big cash bonus. So what do? Do you keep driving? Do you go home? And when we were putting the Uber game together, we interviewed dozens of Uber drivers, and we talked to them about their lived experiences, the stories and the anecdotes that we then turned into these sort of choices that we presented to you. But we actually also asked them really detailed, specific numbers for the numbers that questions about the numbers that underpin the game. So how many rides do you complete on average in an hour? What is the average fare per ride? What is your average fuel cost in a week? And from all of these numbers and these data, we constructed a sort of really simplified economic model that underpins the entire game. And then, like any other piece of journalism that we would do at the Financial Times, we spoke to people. We went to talk to economists who studied the gig economy and the sharing economy. We took all of what we found to Uber to see if they wanted to respond, to see if they had any comments. They declined to comment. And it was really important to us that we stuck to a lot of the rigorous processes of doing journalism that we would do in the normal formats that we were really familiar with, because I feel like at the end of the day, this distinguishes between a piece of journalism that employs emotional storytelling and employs game design techniques compared to just a very socially conscious but ultimately fictional game, which can also be really good, and lots of game designers are doing a lot of that as well. The Uber game was a big success for us. We got some awards for it. More than 500,000 people around the world have now played this game. And one of the most amazing things is that each of these 500,000 people has spent an average of 20 minutes playing the game. To put this into context, for an average Financial Times article, people spend just 1 minute reading it, if we're lucky. And so, 1 minute and 20 minutes is a big difference. But beyond the accolades, beyond the engagement, beyond the analytics, beyond the numbers, The reason why I say the Uber game is a success for us is because of some of the feedback that we've received. So people have come up to me to say that after they have played the game, they began to empathize a little bit more with the Uber drivers that they encounter, that the next time they stepped into a car, they were a bit more interested in that person in the front seat as a person instead of just as a driver. We've had drivers come up to us saying that playing the game made them stop and think about their place and their role within this system. And the success of the game emboldened us to continue to try to use game design techniques to tell other stories in journalism. This is something we released last year, where you play as a trade consultant, helping mainly US companies trying to import goods from China into the US, and then suddenly now having to deal with these new tariffs that have come in place because of the US-China trade war. And again, it's all based on facts and reporting, so data from the Commerce Department, filings from actual companies, where they have been trying to apply for an exemption from some of the tariffs. But at the end of the day, it's actually also a game about that sort of Kafkaesque feeling of being a company or a person trying to navigate a big bureaucracy with changing rules and uncertain outcomes, and sometimes really insufficient responses as to why your application got rejected. I'm going to mention this quickly just because we released it a week sort of right before I got on the plane to come here to Bucharest. This is our third news game. This one is called The Trade-Off. And in this one, you play as a chief executive because they need empathy too. And you're trying to balance between profit and purpose. So you have limited resources. Do you spend them keeping your shareholders happy by meeting your short-term targets and making money, or do you spend them doing good for the environment, doing good for society? I love games, and I grew up playing them. I grew up trying to design them, on my own, and not very successfully. But I think that at the end of the day, games are really good at teaching people what systems are and how they work. But at the end of the day, they're really just one of the storytelling formats that we can use to combine emotional storytelling with factual journalism. I think that we can also do journalism that is poetry.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, you're right. You don't need to visit the north of Ireland to understand the border. You need to have lived here. When the border was no man's land, neither your land nor my land, a ragged stretch of spike. And because you do not like to think it's a problem, does not mean it vanishes. A trick of the eye, a trompe-l'oeil. Just because you have said the problem is imaginary does not disappear the thread of reality. I used to assume that magical thinking meant wide eyes, a vision that doesn't stop with the sky, creative view on old to make it new. But now, sure, someone from the EU accused Westminster of magical thinking. No assumptions anymore about what magic is.
Right. So this is a documentary and a poem about the Irish backstop. And I'll try to explain it in as quick and succinct and as easy a way as possible. The Irish backstop is a contentious point between Britain and the EU in terms of how Britain will exit the EU in Brexit. It's a sort of insurance policy and a plan B for what will happen by default on the actual border with customs checks and border checks if no agreement has been reached. And for a large part of the Brexit process, it's been one of the main sticking points, and it's really important. And we wanted to explain what this is to people, but we also really wanted to convey the fact that it's not actually really just an abstract concept, right? Like the Irish border is a real place with real people living on both sides of it, with a real and often very fraught history. So to try to get a sense of that emotion across, we commissioned Claire Dwyer-Hogg, who is an Irish poet, to write a poem about the backstop and the feelings it evokes based off of reporting in the Financial Times, based off of what politicians have been saying about the issue. And then we got Stephen Ray, who's an Irish actor, to perform a reading of the poem on the actual border itself. And the whole thing was orchestrated, put together, and filmed and directed brilliantly by my colleague, Juliette Riddell. And again, I think poetry is another one of those storytelling techniques and storytelling traditions that is really suited to conveying emotional truths, but it's also, again, not the only one. We can also try to do journalism where we work with theater makers.
What do you want me to say? Or, more importantly, how do you want me to say it? I could stand here and narrate my world to you like it's the opening credits of a disaster movie. This is the setup. 2050. Far enough in the future for all this to seem plausible. Climate catastrophe reported as normality, the daily index of maximum time allowed outside in Doha or Austin or Manchester. In all these places, it is over 50 degrees centigrade. If you go outside for more than your allotted hour, then you will die. Some specific new tragedy. Targeted bioweapon takes out Cape Town as the statelets of a collapsed South Africa fight for water. First use of live ammunition to keep the hordes out on the Italian-Swiss border. I could be a newsreader, if we still have those.
So this is another one of Juliette's filmed, came out more recently. And both of these films we put under the category of something we call FT Standpoint. And the way that we think about them is that they're kind of the visual video equivalent of an opinion piece that you might read in the Financial Times newspaper. So they definitely have a point of view to them. But it was also actually really important when we did this piece that we worked not just with a writer from the Royal Court Theatre in London to help write the scenarios and the script, but that actually we also worked with climate scientists. Yes, it is a film about an imaginary, hypothetical future of what the news might be like in 2050 if we don't do enough now about the climate crisis. But I don't know if you sort of remember from just now, but like 50 degrees, she said something about sort of like 50 degrees in Doha, in Manchester, in Austin. Why 50 degrees? Why those cities? It's because we spoke to climate scientists who projected that that was what was going to happen in those cities based off of what they know about what is happening now. Yes, I mean, it is a film about what might happen in the future, but for me, the emotional component of it is that it's also a film about how the way we talk about the future affects the way we think about what we can and should be doing today. And I think that in both the case of the climate crisis and with Brexit, emotional storytelling is really important because they are topics where the facts are kind of in abundance and readily and easily available. We know kind of what is happening and the facts around this. And the problem is maybe more that people don't want to engage with these because they have already formed their opinion of it, or because they have become so fatigued by the issue that they just don't really want to think about it anymore. And I think that one of the roles that emotional storytelling can play in journalism is in breaking through that veil a little bit, in presenting things in a new frame, in a new perspective, in a new way, which hopefully might spark people to be curious, to find out more, to have a discussion, to engage with the topic. And emotional storytelling is really powerful in that way in which it affects our cognition, the way in which it opens us up to being receptive to certain facts or closes us off to the same. And it's because of these reasons that I think it's extra important for journalists to grapple with all the complexities of trying to use emotional storytelling in our work. Even though we might not always get it right, we might not do it perfectly, and when we get it wrong, we could be accused of being biased, of not sticking to the facts, of not really, quote unquote, doing journalism. And the reason is because I think intentions matter, and also because we're not the only ones who are alive to the power of emotional storytelling. Advertisers use it to try to get your money. Politicians use it to try to get your vote. And at least when journalists do it, they are hopefully doing it in the service of revealing and conveying the truth. I'm actually pretty encouraged by the fact that this new form of storytelling or this new form of journalism and this new way of thinking about what journalism is and what journalism could be is gathering a bit of momentum, and people are being more alive to the fact that maybe this is a way that journalism can have more positive real-world impact, can connect with the people that we try to serve a bit more, and there are projects happening all over the world. And we're not the only ones. We at the Financial Times are by no means the only ones doing this. So I'm just going to talk through a few with you guys. This is in South Africa. And last year, the Open Societies Foundation funded a project that paired 8 investigative journalists in that country with local theater makers to create new pieces of work that told the stories of some of the investigations that the journalists have done. And the most interesting thing is that it resulted in pieces of work that reached audience who not only would normally never have picked up and bought a newspaper, but also people who normally wouldn't have bought a ticket to go into a theater hall. So this particular one that you see behind me here is the story about the Life Esidimani scandal, where more than 100 mentally ill patients died when the government released them from what was a fairly well-run public facility into private institutions without any of the necessary oversights. A lot of them died from neglect, from poor conditions, and the playwright worked together with the journalist who sort of uncovered and sort of reported on the scandal, and they constructed this sort of play where the audience plays as part of Greek chorus in an ancient Greek tragedy to allow people, and especially families and people who knew some of the victims, to give voice to their grief. And one of the most amazing things about this is that the entire play, the set, the props, everything, fit into this metal trunk, which is also used as a prop in the play, which allowed them to hook it to the back of a car and drive it out and do performances on roadsides, in village squares, in front of schools, anywhere where there might be people who would be interested. This is the Diwali Centre in Amsterdam, and for the last year or so, they've been pioneering a really interesting new form of live journalism that combines reporting with theater and with debates and discussions. And so the first project that they did was around the working poor in Amsterdam and what it means to be a working poor in Amsterdam. And the reporting, the facts about the statistics of the working poor in Amsterdam was really a sort of jumping off point for some of the emotional storytelling around the people who are actual working poor. But all of this is tied together in service of creating a space for civic dialogue. So they worked really hard to get people to come into the Culture Center who are not just the victims and the people affected and the people who are the working poor, but also employers and also city aldermen and regulators. And somehow this combination of being in a physical space, of the theatrical presentation of some of the information, helped make it a safer space, an easier space for people to have those difficult civic conversations. And because it was all grounded in facts and reality of what is actually happening in Amsterdam, they could focus the discussion more on where do we go from here? What do we need? How are we going to react to this? They're not alone. This is happening. Lots of other organizations and people are also doing these sort of engaged journalisms that bring people together in physical spaces. In the UK, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, the Bureau Loco, some of them are here actually, so you guys can ask them about this project after I'm done. They've started doing story circles where, again, you convene people who are affected by the issue that you're investigating to come together and have a discussion and talk about their experiences. And I think these gatherings are meaningful and important, not just because it helps turn journalism a bit more into a conversation, a bit more into a two-way conversation about what is going on versus, versus just a one-way broadcast, a one-way, we've done the work, we found out what's important, we're gonna tell you what it is. But because when you're all sitting around a table and talking about how it affects you, then you stop being just a statistic and a data point. Whether it's homelessness in the case of the Bureau Loco or the working poor in the case of Amsterdam, you get to talk a little bit about your life experience and your emotional truth. So I'm pretty encouraged by the fact that, more of this stuff is happening. People seem to find new ways to try to do this sort of thing. But I wanted to actually close by saying that if we are talking about healing and real societal change, maybe it requires a little bit more. That yes, it is possible for journalists to use the techniques of emotional storytelling to create as Krista Tippett says, a hospitable space. And yes, it is possible for us to do the work of reporting and verifying facts to create a foundation and a common ground to grapple the hard questions of our time. But the actual work of healing, the actual grappling of the question, relies on all of us. And you can't force healing, and sometimes maybe the times and the conditions have to be right for them. In the case of Hong Kong, I don't know if now is the right time for healing. The wound is still being carved as I speak. But I do hope that one day the time for healing will come, and that when that day comes, journalists like us will be there to help facilitate the process. Thank you very much.